Hi, everybody. Looks like we're live now. Appreciate everybody showing up and being available. As you can see from the Summit page, we have a pad set up for simultaneous discussion and text. The IRC channel is active as well. And we'll be using the Hangout for some of the discussion too. The topic for this session is a Git-based workflow for Ubuntu package maintenance. We have a couple of different ways of going about it in how you use a Git-based workflow, and our initial use case was primarily merges. From an Ubuntu perspective. So how does the server team, which is hence the naming of the tool right now, how does the server team do a merge and make merges easy to do going forward when we have to kind of rebase back to Debian on a regular basis? As a result of the work we've done to support that use case, though, we found a bunch of other use cases that we think are useful and are interesting. What I will do is I've got a very simple presentation. I'll try to make that my screen. Give me 1 second. Let's see if that works. So very simple slides. We're going to talk about everything on them, so it's not super important. The first thing we want to talk about, though, going into the discussion, and I want to preface this by saying, if you have something specific you'd like to discuss or clarity, or you want to deep dive on something, feel free to put it in the group chat or on IRC or in the pad, and we'll try and focus on answering questions from people that are actively involved. But for the first part of this was a discussion of just why we needed a tooling or a tool and imports in general. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to Robbie to kind of discuss. Robbie, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So there are a number of tools in this area. There's Dget, there's GBP, there's Git-DPM, and so on. So what have we done? Why have we done it? Why aren't we using Dget? Why aren't we using GBP or any of the other tools? Well, we had a particular use case that we were trying to fix, which is to do what we call Ubuntu merges. These are very different from what you do when you type git merge. So maybe the terminology is bad. It's closer to something like a git rebase, replaying the Ubuntu Delta that we used to have based on an old version of a Debian package onto the new version of the Debian package. And for that, we needed things like the parenting of the commits to be correct between Debian and Ubuntu. We needed a tree that reflected that branching off that is their sense of essence of what Ubuntu is, branching off the Debian development line and so on. So I think it's very important to look at what we've done in the context of that use case that we were trying to solve. If where an alternative didn't fulfill that use case, well, that is the reason why we didn't do it that way. We focused on incremental changes to try and slowly move towards further and further automation, but where each step gave us an immediate efficiency benefit. So that's why we have ended up where we are now. So one of the interesting side effects of our work is that one of the things that we've done is created the ability for an importer to maintain a Git tree, wherever that Git tree may be, that reflects both Debian and Ubuntu package source changes, and we import them wholesale where we don't have any further information, or we can import them with individual logical commits where we have availability of those individual logical commits. A consequence of this is that it means that there are a whole bunch of other use cases which we now sort of accidentally fulfill. The first obvious one, if I skip drive-by contributions, the first obvious one is archaeology and review. It means that you can just look at a Git tree that our importer produces. You can look at it in Git-K or Git-Log or whatever tool you prefer to use for Git, having cloned it from just a straightforward Git repository. And you will be able to see exactly how the lines between Debian and Ubuntu diverged, converged, and so on. the other things is because that is there and it can remain up to date. Currently, we run the importer manually, but we could run that automatically. It means that things like drive-by contributions become possible. It means that there's an actual place for someone to say git clone from here. For example, someone appeared in Ubuntu Devil the other day and said, where can I find the git for binutils as it is in 1604, because there's a bug that I want to patch? And I couldn't give him an answer, a straightforward answer, which is, here's a Git URL that you can throw at git clone and it'll work. Well, with this tool, we can do that. I realize that Dget does something very similar with what it's doing. So it it does appear that we are duplicating this, but really it's the way we've done it is different, and that's a consequence of the approach that we took. So similarly, because Launchpad just allows you to throw something at something, a Git repository at Launchpad, and it'll appear in your personal space, that means that it's quite easy for someone to then take what we have, which I tried this the other day. I wanted to make a set of changes to Dovecot that only affected the Ubuntu Delta for Dovecot for complicated reasons. Well, it was easy for me just to clone from the importer tree and then push back to my personal package space, and then just send a colleague a merge proposal against that for him to be able to review. And because Launchpad already has that functionality there, all we needed to add was the fact that there's a Git repo, which happened as an accident of what we were doing with Ubuntu merges. So it's just the case that we end up with a whole bunch of use cases that get enabled by our work, and that's not by any means to say that it doesn't do so for dget or with Git DPM or any of the other tools. GBP did a lot of this stuff in some way anyway quite a long time ago. So what I wanted to talk about in this session, or I think we're quite interested in understanding, is what to do next. So we have this thing, it works for us. What are the wider scopes that we could accommodate? How does this fit into Dget, and what should we do about this? Because I would like to be able to recommend one thing for people to be able to do. I think that's really useful, rather than being able to say to people, well, you could do this or you could do that. And so that's really the core thing here. What should we do next? And in terms of this particular session, I don't know whether it's that we want to talk about these potential other use cases, or people are just interested in what we did with our Ubuntu merge use case, or people are interested why we picked that over another, or we have, if we have any third parties here who aren't that involved in Ubuntu development but do want to know how to do a drive-by contribution, that might be something that we can talk about as well and focus on that use case. I'd love to get some feedback on that. Please just let us know in IRC why you're here and what you're interested in us talking about, and maybe we can move in that direction. Meanwhile, shall I go back to Nish and he can just do a quick intro on what we've done?
Sure. And it looks like there was one question in the IRC channel as well, Robbie, asking, for Michael, I think, asking, does Debian keep their package sources in Git now?
Yeah. Shall I try and answer that? Or I don't know. Well, I'll try and answer that, but the others might be able to. I can see some people who probably know a better answer than I do. But let me try it. So in Debian, packages are maintained by the maintainer, where the maintainer is either an individual or maybe a team or a nominated set of people. And between themselves, they decide how to maintain the package. So they can choose whether to maintain their package in Git, and if so, how. Or they can choose to maintain their package without any VCS whatsoever, or with any other VCS system, Mercurial, Bazaar, whatever else they want. It's not really anything that's enforced by policy in Debian. And as a consequence of this, in Ubuntu, when we're maintaining, say, I'm on the Ubuntu server team and I maintain all of the server packages for Ubuntu, it is in my remit, I will have to deal with whatever VCS or not that Debian happen to be using. And in addition to that, now there are multiple ways of maintaining your package sources in Git. And indeed, some of those ways have multiple options, which make things different. So I don't know if that really, how well that answers that question, but that's my view on does Debian maintain package sources in Git? The answer is sort of maybe, depending on the package.
Right, and that was also the answer I put on IRC. Yeah.
Now, one nuance I would add there. Yes, maintainers absolutely can choose what workflow works best for them in Debian, but we do have on the Hangout today, we have Ian Jackson, who's been doing work around providing a consistent interface, consistent Git-based workflow for all Debian packages, so that whether or not the maintainer is using a Git-based workflow or not, there is a Git view on all Debian packages that provides a consistent experience that that anyone downstream or anybody in Debian, whether that's the Debian maintainer, Debian NMUer, non-maintainer uploader, can use a consistent workflow on. And there are currently some mismatches between the Dget workflow and the Ubuntu merges importer that Nish and Robbie, you've been working on. So I'd love for us to spend some time talking about that.
Okay. Why don't I create an agenda at the top of the pad? And this can be like a dynamic agenda. So I've just noticed one question from Coder Europe asking about translations. Steve would like to talk about Dget versus, well, I'll call it USD for now. And Barry wanted to talk about UDD replacement. Okay, so what I propose we do next then is, before we go into those topics, does Nish want to go into, I think he has some slides prepared on what we're currently doing, because I think what we're currently doing is quite relevant for everyone to understand in order to enter into any of the other 3 points that we've got on the agenda.
Sure. Yeah, the slides I have are pretty light, and they're just meant to kind of be a quick review of what we have available to us in both our tooling as well as just how we expect some of these use cases to work right now. This is just kind of a gloss very quickly. We have kind of a shorthand form. Launchpad lets you do kind of or Git lets you do URL rewriting essentially. And we throughout this are using LPUSI : to just kind of represent our current Git space. It just makes the URL shorter and stuff throughout the following slides. But I want to make sure that was clear ahead of time. And in my case, I have it linked to my username, but it'd be whatever your Launchpad username would be. So as Robbie was mentioning earlier, one thing we've done and have used it for pretty successfully since the Xenia release on the server team is a merge workflow using Git. And very quickly, it's really become something more than an interactive rebase. So we have kind of 3 standard expectations that we know what we were based on before, which is what we call our old Debian, which is really nothing more than a merge base of where Ubuntu is relative to where Debian was. And then we have an old Ubuntu, which is actually where we currently are. And then a new Debian, which is where we want to get to. We want to merge to the new release from Debian. And all our process ends up looking like is we first spend some time breaking what we call the delta, which is just the changes that are in Ubuntu that are not in Debian down into logical changes. Those don't always exist because, like Robbie mentioned earlier, as for Debian, just like for Ubuntu, it's no requirement that there is a VCS being used by developers. All we really have are the uploads going into the archive. So what the import represents is purely the archive state as it transitions from one publish to another in a series. It doesn't break it down on its own. And so one of the requirements for doing the merge itself, from the Ubuntu perspective for the merge, is to break that delta down into logical changes, each commit then becoming one change, so that they can then be replayed onto the merge target. And that actually ends up working pretty well. And that's essentially all a merge becomes. It just becomes this rebase step. There's like a prep step for the rebase, which is just breaking down the delta, and then you're able to rebase it. And that works pretty well. The second use case that Robbie mentioned is drive-by contributions. And it's just kind of a term for, there are people that will want to help make Ubuntu better and want to do it quickly and easily, and maybe are used to how GitHub does things, where they have pull requests that are very trivial to produce. And they would like something similar for an Ubuntu source package. In our case, basically, you can do a git clone with the URL rewrite I mentioned earlier for a source package. You can make some changes and push that up to your, as Robbie mentioned, your user's namespace repository that corresponds. And then you can submit a merge request. And Launchpad will do some of the logic of tying them together. The administrator of the package, in our case right now, it's just a few of us that are currently on the server team, basically will go and approve it and merge it into the official tree. And I apologize, there's a typo on the last line. We have written a wrapper tool called USD that tries to make some of these steps easier. And one thing we have is a clone subcommand, which does nothing more than wrap some of the logic of what remote to clone and where branches should be and things like that. So you can just do a USD clone source package name. And if the repository exists in the imported tree, it goes and sets up a local Git repository that tracks things correctly and has some nice usability features for just doing this kind of process. As Robbie also mentioned, there's a use case for archaeology and review. These are two separate things, but they're also very similar, very interrelated. So from an archaeology perspective, it's trivial right now to do a git clone and to go into the directory and run gitk, which by default, because of the way you probably will end up looking at the development release. But you could look at the entire branch history for Debian and Ubuntu, and you get this very interesting graph. I think it's interesting, being relatively new to Ubuntu development, of how the delta has grown and shrunk and been merged and synced over time since Ubuntu started, essentially. And you get a very clear idea of when packages have been diverging for a very long time, because it's very clear from gitk or any other tool you would want to use for looking at that kind of history. You also can do things like when you're looking at, for instance, Robbie recently has been doing SRU reviews, stable release update reviews. It becomes easy to do analysis of different branches, comparing the changes in one branch to another. You can look at whether the commits make sense. You also, from the purpose of executing an SRU, you get a benefit of you can now maybe do cherry picking if the commit does come across, which makes it easier to make sure the same change is being applied to all the releases of Ubuntu. And so backporting changes becomes a little bit less error prone in some ways and easier to verify. Another case, and this is something that just I've used a couple times just to have a place to change things. I can maintain changes against a package very easily by just having a branch that kind of follows the tip, which we call Ubuntu devel, of the development release in Ubuntu. I can make changes on top of it, go and grab the latest imported tree and rebase onto that, and I'm continuously following the latest version. I can then publish that to a PPA. We can do a lot of different things there, from just keeping a workflow going or helping making sure bugs get tested and things. The last use case that is pretty interesting is it also becomes a little bit easier, and this is more an attribute of just using Git, I think maybe necessarily than our workflow. Because it's distributed development and it's easy to collaborate, we get a much more straightforward way of saying we can have multiple people working on bug fixes or different areas of the code at the same time, and we can get them all back together and then upload one set of changes that all work together or test it in a PPA. The importer makes some assertions about that the trees will always be the same. So the tree is just the unpacked source from dpackage. Excuse me. And I know Ian and Robbie will want to talk about what exactly that unpacked source should look like. And we can get to that right after this. But it becomes clear that you can, if you are using the same base tree as someone else, or even if you ran it locally, you'll get the same tree. You'll get the same SHAs for everything that's published in Launchpad. And that becomes very nice because then you're not reliant necessarily on the importer running automatically in the background on a server. You can just run it for any package you care about locally, and you'll get the SHAs that would be run by the importer. And this is just a very last comment. It's just kind of a note that if you touch Debian changelog and in changes, this is true of a lot of places. I don't think it's something specific to our tooling. And you do that before you're ready to upload or when you're working with someone else, you'll get a lot of merge conflicts. So it's easiest in a lot of ways to have logical commits, like we talked about before, where each logical commit message ends up being what you'd want to put in Debian changelog. And then it's easy to replay the changelog as the last thing you do before you upload. In this case, and I apologize, it's kind of cut off at the end, is very similar to what we said before, but essentially being able to do what a developer in Ubuntu can do, which is they're able to upload. So it's very similar to the drive-by contribution, except that you're able to actually do an upload. Our tooling doesn't fully support uploading in and of itself, but it's a sort of a trivial set of steps. If you know how to upload, it's a trivial set of steps to do that. I saw that there was a question, I saw someone else pointed out, on IRC of how to file bugs. There is a project page, and I will put that in the pad for the importer itself, and that can be filed bugs against the imported trees, bugs against the imported tooling, or feature requests and things like that. We're happy to take requests, and we'll prioritize as appropriate. I do see that there's quite a few questions going on in IRC or discussion. That's good to see. And at this point, I think I'm going to hand it back to Robbie, because I think you guys are talking actively about some of the discussions that Steve wanted to talk about as well.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the intro, Nish. Shall I sort of hand this over to, or shall we start with the Dget versus USDI thing? Because that's sort of tied into UDD reply. Oh, I don't know. Okay, let's start from there because it's somewhere. So I don't know how to approach this discussion. So, Steve, do you have a suggestion about where to begin?
Well, I don't know. So I would actually say that maybe it's a good moment for Ian to kind of describe the principles of Dget. Now that we've heard about the importer that you guys have written, to hear from Ian what the design goals of Dget are, and then try to understand if these are compatible, and if so, what the path might be to get them there.
Okay.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the Dget came out of a DevConf session. What I wanted to do was to produce a way where you could work on Debian packages in Git, no matter what the Debian maintainer's workflow was. And when I say Debian packages, I meant also packages in any Debian derivative. So Dget does in fact support Ubuntu right now. Because I wanted to, so there's a lot of complicated stuff that doesn't need to be gone into, but I had to make some important decisions. The most important decision was what the Git representation of an imported source package would look like. A lot of tools, including Git build package, normally like to work with unpatched source trees. I decided they weren't really sensible because I wanted to produce a workflow that and a tooling and a kind of environment where users would see something that looked like a normal Git user would expect to see. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Debian packaging specific stuff that can't be got rid of, but certainly the idea that you would Git clone your package or whatever, and then actually you'd have to separately apply some quilt patches in order to get the source code that you were actually using, seemed quite. It's not something anybody outside the sort of who's not familiar with the Debian usual Git workflows would expect. So I chose to use packages applied trees. I wasn't in a position really previous attempts to do something similar in Debian blocked on the fact that Debian didn't really have a suitable Git server, and that it looked like solving this problem would involve writing an importer robot that looks maybe a bit like the importer robot that you now have written. And we decided that we could come up with a design where that wasn't necessary. So Dget has a sort of twin model where there's a Git server that contains Git pushes, and there's also the archive that contains things uploaded some other way, maybe by a maintainer who's not using Dget. the archive is in some sense canonical in that you can get a .dsc from the archive, and if that package was in fact uploaded with Dget, there's a commit hash in the .dsc that tells you, it promises you that that Git commit, which you will find on the Git server, contains the same data. I tried to avoid making any decisions about the shape of the Git history, merely deciding that it should be fast forwarding on each branch effectively. So the result is a tool that works very well for if you're doing an MU or you're a downstream or you're just a user or something, you can effectively just Git merge things from whatever your distro is. Because the importer has to run locally and doesn't share its history with anybody else, and it has to produce a fast forwarding history from your own previous imports, the history that you see in Dget may differ in its history, if not its contents, if you see what I mean. That's undesirable. Eventually, I hope to build an importer that may look a bit like your importer, or I might even use it, to import everything in Debian in an automatic way and produce a canonical import. But that's not how it works at the moment. Looking at USDI, I think the only real thing that's stopping these tools from being quite intercompatible and maybe even replacing some bits of Dget with bits of USDI or vice versa, or at least interworking very, very well indeed, is the question of whether the Git tree, the primary Git tree that you represent in your history, is patches applied or patches unapplied. I assume you don't commit the .pc directory.
Correct. One thing I wondered was that, so it's interesting that you talk about not having a canonical importer. So I'd like to go into this a little bit because I think it might be relevant. So we have a property in our importer, which is, so the only inputs to our importer are source packages that have been published. So therefore the DSCs are known and will never change. Like they should be binary identical, right? And the other input is what we call upload tags, which is how we incorporate if somebody creates more useful commits than just a blanket import, if you follow. So somebody clones something, creates 10 commits which result in one upload. Well, we want ideally to have those 10 commits in the history. So we indicate that to the importer by tagging it with the version. We to upload / and then the version number using the standard Dep14 substitutions, which means that when the importer tries to import that version from the DSC, which is what it does, it's able to identify that someone's actually left in place this extra tag to say, hey, importer, when you see this one coming in, it's actually, here's some more helpful descriptive commits to describe that. So those are the only two imports for the importer, inputs for the importer. And this has a property, which is that given the same inputs, the commit hashes will always be the same. And what it strikes me is that I think Dget should effectively do the same thing-ish, like given the
except I wanted Dget to be actually usable by people who didn't, want to make a great commitment to it. So that means that if you tell Dget you want to work on a package, it does not download every previous version of that package since the dawn of time.
I wondered about that. Right, so if it's not doing that, then
that would obviously be hopelessly, that would make the tool impractical to use.
Yeah.
There are tools in Debian that do that kind of thing. That's for most people, that's like a serious undertaking to take the history of a package or maybe several packages that they're working on and produce a coherent Git history. If we were to settle on an automatic upstream importer for Debian, then we would want to import all the history in a similar way.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
But in the meantime, because so there's this problem, right? So if I import version 1 for the first time that I use it, and you import version 2, we each have a history that starts at a different place. So they're not, they contain the same files, but they have different ancestry.
Okay. Apart from that difference, presumably the commit hashes would be the same.
Yes, indeed. Dget will try to separate out the commits it makes to construct the history from the commits that it uses to import a DSC. So you'll actually find that the actual DSC imports, well, I try not to change the algorithm. I've changed the algorithm once in one point, between 1.x and 2.x. But I'm hoping not to change it.
So what I'm getting at is that there is a certain translatability between a Dget imported tree. I'm talking about a tree-ish to be specific, right? So one particular commit and the tree associated with that, and a USD imported one, which is that they are losslessly translatable from one to the other and back again, I believe.
I think that should be possible, yes.
So what I'm getting at is that okay, let me do it one way round, but I appreciate the other way round is also probably possible. So I could take USD, like our importer, and have something that dynamically makes it look like a Dget style tree to a Dget client. That should be possible, and it should be possible to maintain all the way through. And I think that it might be possible to do it in reverse as well, with the assumption that you started from the beginning of time.
Yes. In fact, I mean, if I can't persuade you to do anything entirely different, I will probably, I've already got code in Dget to do this because I want to support uploads by people using patches unapplied branches as their native packaging branch. I already have that converter there, which at the moment it works by constructing the new, by essentially converting all of the patches and Debian patches into Git commits. No, wait, that's the DSC importer. The patches applied thing will, it will apply all the patches one by one and generate a Git history that represents each patch as a commit.
Is that the quilt fix-up, or is that something?
That's quilt fix-up. Yeah, well, that's one of the quilt fix-up modes. That's quilt fix-up with one of the unapplied modes.
Right.
Okay, so one potential sort of place of common ground is that we might be able to figure out a way to make the two things work in parallel and give users. This isn't. I'm not saying this is ideal, but it's a starting point, which is to give users a sort of a choice of where they can use Dget tooling, and the commit will appear to somebody using our importer tooling, and vice versa. I think.
Right. There is going to be a slight problem there because ideally you want to be able to support. You want the histories, the two sets of histories, to each be fast forwarding, and one of them is converted from the other. The result in the ancestry graph is going to be quite unpleasant, but certainly by the time anybody's done anything at all complicated.
Okay, so this brings us on to a question about ancestry. One of the things that we did in our importer is we made some decisions about what we're doing with ancestry. We made some decisions about what it means for a commit to have a parent. And I think we basically came up with a pretty raw answer, which is, well, if we think it's a parent, it probably is a parent, and it should be marked as a parent. For example, if a user has provided this upload tag, here is a set of commits which bring us up to this thing. The importer will check a sanity check. The tree-ish should be exactly the same as the thing that we imported without the upload tag. If not, then they didn't upload what they say, they just uploaded. But then we just create a commit which has both of those things as parents, both the upload tag and, for example, the previous thing that it was in that particular series in the repository. And this has a tendency to fold everything together. One of the questions I was asked in one of the mailing lists was, what do I do if I'm already maintaining a Git tree, which I'm going to assume is a bit like a Git build package style Git tree outside of this system? And my answer was, well, we probably need to check that this actually works. But as far as I can think of, theoretically, if you provided an upload tag and just said, by the way, this thing that I tagged in my Git build package thing is the same thing that as this version that the importer can use, then the importer should just be able to run through, even retrospectively for old ones if you tag them so. It should just be able to make everything join together. Now, if we did have dget running in parallel in this fashion, then at least from my perspective, I would just make it a parent. And although it would end up a little bit messy, because when you look at Gitk, you'll see two lines. You'll see stuff happening in the dget line, and you'll see stuff happening in our line. And I accept that that's a little bit ugly. I think it is still, to some extent, workable in that there's a bunch of benefits that users would get, or developers would get as a result of this. They'll be able to cherry pick and see all of the things that happened and that sort of thing.
Right, absolutely.
So I think we have that maybe as a potential common ground, even though we both agree it's not really ideal. The next thing then is, what do we do in terms of, well, it seems to me that you are really convinced that quilt pushed without .pc directory is the correct way to store the data in the Git repository. And I'm certainly starting from the perspective that I think that Git popped with no PC directory is the correct way to store that. And if we're not going to have a translation layer, we kind of need to reach an agreement there, I think. So one of us needs to convince the other in some fashion. And I am reasonably open to that. So what I try to do on the mailing list, and I realize I haven't given people, certainly in this session, very long to study this at all for what was a very long email. I really wanted to try and get that down before the session if I could. But I've tried to give a list of reasons as to why I think quilt popped makes sense. And in particular, for our use cases that we try to solve for our Ubuntu merge case. If we can find solutions for those things that don't break us, then I'm okay in principle with not doing it that way. I just want our use cases to work.
Right.
But I think that we might be kind of philosophically opposed on how these things go, because right. So the two barriers that come to mind is that Sean Whitten.
No, sorry, Robbie. Can I just interrupt you here? You said on the mailing list. Which mailing list was this? Is there a link to that in the pad?
Yeah,
On the VCS package.
Yeah, shall I post a link on IRC?
Yeah, if you could throw that in the pad maybe too, that would be great.
Yeah, let me.
It's an enormously long email. Nobody's going to want to read it now.
Yeah, you won't want to read this now. So there it is, and I'll put it on the. I would also nominate, if that sounds okay. I looked. We're discussing it in maybe in Ubuntu Devil Discuss, in Debian Devil. It seems to me that VCS package Discuss is the single most appropriate place to have this conversation.
Sure.
So if everyone's already fine with that, I kind of nominate that as the main list for all discussions related to this kind of stuff for the future, just to try and get everyone who wants to be involved. So the things that I think were issues, and so Sean's response, and this made me think, well, one of the use cases that's very different for us is that we have to deal with, we want to be able to integrate with whatever Debian is giving us. So I'm not really sure how this fits in with Debian source options and single Debian patch. Another thing is what I was saying with when I do an Ubuntu merge, typically I don't actually care about the quilt patch detail. I'm not really particularly interested in cherry picking individual commits, but I am trying to understand what happens when somebody, whereas be it in Debian or somebody not using the system in Ubuntu, has done things like added quilt patches or dropped quilt patches. And I tend to think of those things as a whole. So it makes a massive amount of sense to me when I break down a set of changes into, well, this file was added to Debian patches and added to Debian patches series, because those two things are things I understand when I look at a Git diff. If, on the other hand, I look at a Git diff and I see things happening in Debian patches as well as things happening in the upstream part of the tree, things start to get very confusing for me, especially if I want to cherry pick between them.
Yeah, I can quite see. A lot of people who are used to Git build package have that point of view, and they do get confused because they don't really understand what's going on. I had to make a decision about, what did I think the future ought to look like? Did I want a future in which everybody who worked with Debian packages or Debian derivatives packages in Git would have to learn this stuff about Debian's quilt patches? They would have to know things like, for example, that if you get the Git build patches unapplied tree and you go configure, make install, you're undoing the CVE patches that your distro has applied to the software. There's the whole patches unapplied thing. If you know all about it, it's completely fine because you know that you need to do it and you're not going to forget. But for somebody who doesn't know that that's what's going on, it starts off as a foot gun and then it turns into a nightmare. Why do I have to wrestle with this stuff? Isn't this what we had Git for? And it is actually a version control system. It's just a really bad one.
I don't disagree with any of that.
So I think that overall, I can see that it's confusing for GBP, people who are used to GBP, but it is possible to just take the other approach. And if you look at patches applied trees, you can just exclude the Debian patches directory entirely. It's one of the principles of a dgit tree is that you can ignore the contents of Debian patches. And the tooling will make sure that if there is some patch stuff happening in the source package, that the right thing will be done. And that if necessary, patches will be generated or deleted or whatever thing might need to be done.
So here's an example
Sorry, if I could just interject quickly. One of the things that Ian said there was he had to make a decision about what he thought the future should look like. And I think from what you're saying, Robbie, you guys have done a great job of creating a tool that solves the immediate problems of making merges more efficient for your team, more efficient, less error prone. It's been an accelerator for your team. But as I understand it, you yourself are acknowledging that it's not solving all of the problems related to Git. And my perspective, and I know I'm not the one writing any of this code, so you can take my perspective for what it's worth, but my vision for what this is, and this brings us actually back around to the UDD thing, is that we ought to be able to have a single representation of all of these packages with all of the history that is the one branch, or not one branch, but the one repository, the one set of branches that we need to use for all of these things, both for merges and for upstream contributions and so forth. Do you agree with that vision as something to aspire to? And this is directed at Robbie and Nish and Scott. And if so, do you also agree that getting there requires us to be patches applied in those trees?
So in principle, yes, I would like to do that. In practice, I have some, like if we achieve that, then great. Okay, no objection at all. I have some skepticism as to whether it is possible that we're trying to hide something that is there in terms of, so Ian's absolutely right when he says, foot gun. A user clones the Git tree, runs configure, and now they've just removed all our CVE patches. So I agree that that's a problem. My skepticism is whether we can actually, whether it's possible to cover up all the seams in such a way that all the workflows and use cases and expectations around the tree still work, but having hidden the fact that Quilt was actually there behind the scenes. Now, if there were some kind of version 4 package that might make things easier. And I don't know what form that would have, but I feel that although I can't give a completely straight answer as to yes or no, I'm skeptical as to whether it's possible currently in a way that everything just works. And this is the reason that we didn't use Dget in the first place.
So I'm sure that it can be made to work. I was just talking to the Raspbian guy at the mini DevConf, and I think that he's probably going to adopt Dget. Problems with the reimported Ancestry notwithstanding. The main reason I think that patches apply, I mean, it's true that many of the existing things that you would do to merge a package in your workflow, I haven't been through this let's set of workflows completely, but a lot of those things would need to be changed if they were working with a patches applied tree so that they would do the right thing. You might need a bit of additional tooling, but it's actually possible for us in the Debian community together to work out what that tool should look like and what their behavior should be. And I haven't yet come across situations where there is no correct behavior. And Dget has done some completely crazy stunts. Dget will now automatically create a patches applied branch from a maintainer's patches unapplied branch as necessary, for example, on Dget push. And I intend to do the same thing for Dget pull so that a maintainer can do git pull on some synthetic thing if they don't care very much about the ancestry graph. In terms of merging patches applied trees, it is difficult if you intend to retain the patches. If you really wanted to merge the two patch queues, that's difficult. But if what you wanted to do was produce a correct tree that could be represented as a source package and will produce the correct executables at the end and that can be worked on in Git, then there are always ways of doing that.
Sure. I mean, just as a straw man, one idea that just occurred to me while you've been talking is, and the idea of there being a version 4 format. Well, one of the things you can do with version 3 is you can just say, I'm going to flatten all of Debian patches with single Debian patch. It's a perfectly valid representation of a package. If we were to decide in Ubuntu that this tool is the way forward and that we wanted to actually do UDDH things, it would give us the option to effectively flatten everything in Debian patches, ignore it, still get proper imports, still have history based on Dget that lets us figure out attribution, how things got there, but kind of ignore the patch management entirely on the Ubuntu side if we wanted to go that way.
It's also possible to generate it's fairly straightforward to generate a single squashed patch for all of the Ubuntu changes that represent some arbitrary Git history. Dget already has functionality for doing that. So, I mean, I'll reply to your email in detail. I think these problems are soluble, and furthermore, that we should solve them in the Debian community where we are writing Debian-specific tools that know all about this stuff, so that people who aren't using Debian-specific tools can, don't have a Debian-specific workflow in their head, can do the right thing. And those of us who are doing Debian-specific stuff and complicated merges and what have you, can easily, the Git-based workflows will be so much easier anyway. I think we can get rid of all the make work.
I think. So what do we do in the sort of short to medium term? Because we've got these use cases that work for us with our importer. I don't want to throw them away until the point where using Dget is actually easier for us. So I'm quite happy to discuss, we can carry on the mailing list, I'm quite happy to discuss what those cases are and why I think that they're painful for us to use with Dget. But in terms of, I don't know, who's going to implement that stuff? Because I find it difficult to justify spending developer time on something which only has a really long-term benefit, which is, I guess, really the fundamental reason why we have the importer today and why we haven't done that inside Dget, because doing it in Dget would have been harder for our particular use cases, at least to start with, I think.
Well, that's a decision for you to make. If you do something that's not compatible with what I think the rest of the world needs to see, then I suppose I'll have to write compatibility code myself. Then there'll be this sort of strange thing where you'll be encouraging Ubuntu users to use USDI, and I'll be encouraging Ubuntu users to use Dget.
It's interesting. So we have a set of use cases. I don't particularly, if people could do, so our community drive-by contribution use case, I think is an important one.
Right,
and I accept,
that's a prime use case for Dget as well.
Yeah, and I accept, so what I was about to say was, I accept that your particular concerns about our format apply to USDI, whereas they don't apply to Dget. That is one advantage that Dget has for that particular use case. So for that use case, I'm not sure if Dget were available tomorrow to do that, right? So if there were a tree that a drive-by contributor could clone, and there were both one from our tree and there was one from the Dget tree, I'm not sure which one I would recommend.
Well, Dget's available now for Ubuntu.
Okay, but you don't get the history, which is actually quite important if you... Well, I guess it depends on the use case.
Right, it's true you don't get the history. That's because, your history has only just turned up. And if your history stays the way it is, then I will have to write some kind of importer for it, because obviously I want Dget users to see your history and I'll have to convert it. And presumably at some point, somebody will have to help me write the part of, I think people should be allowed to Dget push to Ubuntu, and that means that Dget will have to convert everything back again. This all seems a bit suboptimal, but, I've taken the view with Dget that, I'm trying to produce a view of sanity on top of madness, and that means that Dget is full of thousands of lines of conversion code. I've got most of that conversion code. I just need to apply it to the right way.
I think that's probably a good place to kind of agree. That I will agree with you as well, because I think our importer also has some of this knowledge of how to take something that might be mispublished and things like that, and how to munge it into the right format. You helped respond to the ... and dep14 and things like that. We find corner cases all over the place where very strange versions show up, or dates that are not legal dates show up. And you have to do something with that source still, but you can't really use all the tooling you are used to using. They just fail generally. But I wanted to interrupt only because we're actually out of time session-wise. So the IRC session is probably going to end so that the next session for UOS can start. Michael, as far as I can tell, are we allowed to keep using the Hangout if we have questions to answer?
Well, I need to be in the next Hangout, and because I'm the one hosting this one, it's going to end as soon as I drop off.
Okay, how about we create a separate Hangout for anyone who wants to carry on the conversation? Would that be acceptable to everyone?
Yep, that would be good. If you can do an on-air so that people can watch it later, that would be even better. But if you can't get that going, then just a regular Hangout would do.
So I struggle to create that, so because apparently I don't have permission to do something.
I can try and start that up right now.
You created an on-air Hangout. It just couldn't be embedded was the only problem with what you said.
Okay, so I can do that again.
Yes.
Yeah, all right, okay. So shall I do that? And I'll just paste the one link to the channel that we're in with the new Hangout URL so that people know where to go.
Yep, sounds good. And put it in the Etherpad doc too, so that people who follow along on the previous video can find the new one.
Okay, I'm creating a space for that now. You can see where it'll appear. Thanks, Mike.
All right. Thank you, everybody. It was a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.